So what's up? Just correcting this or adding in punctuation really so I can.
If you're on a sailboat, you're really offshore. The usual things on which you depend aren't there, and there's no safety net, really. I mean, it either works or it doesn't work, and it's very kind of blatant. You can see that it worked or it didn't work. And what happens on a sailboat is not a lot of telling people what to do. What happens on a sailboat that is a well-run ship is that there's an opening for people to act effectively. And I remember, for instance, I once sailed to Hawaii, and one of the things that those of you who don't sail should know, bad things only happen at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they only happen when the weather's bad. All the bad things wait. They store it up all day long when it's sunny and pleasant out and everybody's awake. And they only happen when it's bad. And what happened was that one of the lines that held the sail up chafed through. And never mind all the technical noise, but everybody had to get out of their bunks and scramble up on deck, and the boat was pitching, and it was pitch black, and the wind was blowing, and it was a good thing nobody needed a lot of orders, because they wouldn't have been able to hear the orders anyhow over the noise of the wind. But it has always struck me very deeply how people could work together without a lot of instruction, without being told what to do, and that they could work together so cooperatively. And I always said, why should that be limited to a sailboat? Why can't we get that on shore?
The material for this audio tape was recorded at 4 consecutive sessions of a live nationally broadcast seminar series offered by Werner Erhard and Associates and conducted by Werner Erhard. On the tape, you will hear Werner Erhard working with different men and women as they carve out the distinctions of leadership that will be useful to them in accomplishing their own goals and commitments.
Now, we're going to do 4 sessions on leadership, and there's lots of work to do. However, the very first thing that I want us to engage in, the first thing I want to inquire into, is the issue of leadership itself. And I want to give you a kind of story that'll have 2 or 3 players in the story, 2 or 3 characters in the story, and I'd like you to look at leadership from each of the characters' perspective. So this is a story about tennis, my new concern, you see. And in my study of coaching, I've had to pick a subject about which to be coached, and one of the guys for whom I have enormous respect happens to be a tennis coach. So consequently, I'm studying tennis, but not really. I'm actually studying coaching with a tennis coach. So we play tennis. And in tennis, there's a court and 2 or 4 people on the court and a net and lines and a ball and a racket. And what we ordinarily don't notice, but which is present in every game of tennis, is there are stands with people sitting in the stands watching the game. Now, you may play on a tennis court where there's nobody around. As a matter of fact, you may have the wall against which you play tennis. You know, you bang the ball up against the wall and it comes back, and you don't even have an opponent, like a live opponent, and you think you're playing tennis by yourself with no observers. But remember, you're always the observer. You are your own observer. And as a matter of fact, most people in most situations in life, while they think they're on the court playing are really in the stands observing. And they live as the observer. So I want to establish, I want to create, I want to generate a world, a distinction called the domain of an observer giving an account. Tennis lives, life lives, leadership lives in the domain of an observer giving an account. So there's a tennis game going on in the stands. Even when you're your own stands and you happen to have a racket in your hand, be standing on the court. But I want you to start establishing for yourself like a distinction, like a domain, like a distinct domain that life can live, life can show up, life can be lived in the domain of an observer giving an account. We think life is lived in the action and that there's a commentary that goes along with the action. Now I'm asking you to bring forth out of the background of all of it a distinct domain in which life shows up. Life is there. Where you find life is up in the stands. There's a game going on in the stands. And it's going on in the observation of an observer giving an account. It's not just pure observation. It's not a movie camera making a record. It's a movie camera making a record with a commentary and significances and meaning and assessments and judgments and values and all of that stuff. So we've got this domain of distinction in which leadership can show up. And that one domain of distinction is the domain of an observer giving an account. Now I want to bring forth from this background another domain of distinction. And the other domain of distinction is the domain called presence. Tennis as a presence. Now, one of the things that I'd like you to see is that in tennis like a presence, there isn't a tennis racket. I want you to notice that the racket is rarely, if ever, actually present in the game called tennis. And yet, up in the stands, that racket is something very, very present. When you're really playing tennis, when you're really into the game and it's going well, you aren't present. If you can kind of remember back to some activity in which you were thoroughly engaged and totally engaged, and something really happening, you'll notice that you are not there like an identity. There's no George down on the court for you. But remember, up in the stands, in the domain of an observer giving an account, there's really a George there. So there's a distinction between the showing up of leadership like a presence and the showing up of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account. For the most part, it's true that you and I live in the domain of the observer giving the account. Now, I've told two lies, which I want to clear up. They're technical lies and therefore important later. And that's why I want to clean them up now. Number one, for a great tennis player, the racket is actually present, but in a way that's unusual from our ordinary everyday perspective. It's present as transparent. So present as transparent is different than not present. something can be present as transparent. See, I just happened to look down at Charlie, and I was thinking back to when I was racing. When I first began to race, the car was very there. You know, the shift lever and the clutch and the steering wheel and the wheels and the track and the road, and all that stuff got to be very, very, you know, like up in my face, present. And when I actually started to be able to drive a race car, like be a race car driver, the car became transparent to the driving, to the racing. The car became transparent to the racing. So I wanted you to be clear that presence doesn't mean noticed or focused on or up in your face or what you might call experienced. Because when things are most present, they're often transparent. Transparency may be the height of presence. Now, I don't want you to take that like some dictate that I'm giving you, but rather something to kind of work with and consider. You know, can you bring the tools of living up to the level of transparency? And is it possible that something is most powerfully present when it's transparent? And it's not like not being there, which we often say that's powerful, but being there transparently, maybe. See, I say it like a assertion to begin with, but I don't really want to give it to you as an assertion. There's no power that way. I'm inviting you to inquire into the nature of presence as a distinction, including the possibility of transparency as a very powerful presence. Okay, the other lie that I told you was to say that we live in the domain of an observer giving an account. That's not true. We actually live in a domain of a collapsed distinction in which the distinction of observer giving an account isn't distinguished. So while I gave us credit for too much, we're really not that far along. We don't even live in a domain of an observer giving an account. That wouldn't be so bad. We live in these collapsed distinctions in which nothing is distinct. But for the moment, it's useful to say that for the most part, particularly with this issue of leadership, we live in the domain of an observer giving an account. The thing I want you now to start to inquire into, to engage with, is that leadership as a phenomenon in the domain of an observer giving an account is an entirely distinct phenomenon from leadership as a presence. If you learn what there is to learn about leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account, if you master leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account, you may never be able to exercise leadership, because leadership exercise lives in the domain of presence. It lives in action. It lives as a presence. It doesn't live in the domain of an observer giving an account. I dare say that almost everything you know about leadership is known in the domain of an observer giving an account. If you read most books on leadership, they absolutely do not address leadership as a presence. Now, I want to start teasing that out with you. So first off, I want you to kind of remember a time when you've been in the presence of leadership, either either your own or someone else's. But you've been in the presence of leadership, and I want to ask you, if you did an investigation, could you find leadership any place? When you're being a leader, is there leadership any place, like a presence? Yeah, in the conversation of the people who are watching you, observing, giving an account, there's leadership there. Where is it? It's in their mouth as a conversation and in their structure of interpretation as an observation. But I'm talking about like a presence. If you walk into the office of a man or a woman who's a real leader, do you find any leadership in their pockets? Do you find any leadership in their pocketbook, in the drawers of their desk, in the wastepaper basket, under the rug, hiding in the corner? Can you find leadership any place? The answer is no. As a phenomenon, there is no such a thing as leadership as a presence. And that's the first shocking realization that you must come to in order to conduct an authentic, empowering inquiry into the possibility of leadership. It's kind of like there's no such thing as leadership. And in order to inquire into leadership in a way that can make a difference, like opening a clearing for your leadership, opening a clearing for your mastery of leadership, the first thing you got to know is there's no such thing. You never find leadership. If you think about, try to remember, not like a story, but being in the presence of those moments when you were a leader, you'll notice that the notion of leadership wasn't even there. It's not until afterwards that you say, oh my God, man, I was leading. Hey, not bad. But by that time, you're up in the stands. So you're no longer on the court. Down on the court, there is no leadership. And what we're going to want to do is to inquire what is present on the court in those moments in the stand, in those moments when in the stand there's a conversation about leadership going on in the court. What's actually down there? Like, really? Because there ain't no leadership down there. What's really down there? See, what is it that you got to be correlated with? What is it you've got to be dancing with such that you're saying isn't merely arbitrary? What is it that empowers people saying? That's the question of this 4 sessions, really. Because if you got that, you may not be able to write the book on leader, but you are a leader. You may not be able to have interesting, sterling conversations about leadership with which to impress people, but you will be a leader. Fabulous opportunity. I mean, incredible. Like, really brings me to the edge of my seat. What is this thing? Gee, I don't want an answer. I'm not looking for the answer. I'm looking to engage in the question such that I am in that domain. And that's the listening which I'm inviting you to bring to the seminar. I want to be with it. And I want us to be related in such a way that the possibility of your being with it is present for you. I don't care whether you got the answer. In fact, that would be disinteresting. I mean, suppose somebody did have the answer. Suppose Elizabeth had the answer. She said, oh, I know the answer. She told us the answer. Like, oh, so what? Really, who would care? There's a way of inquiring. And that way of inquiring that I'm describing, I call transformation. There's a way of inquiring or being engaged with something such that you're empowered with respect to it rather than more able to talk about it afterwards. I know I've read this to some of you before, and I want to read it again anyhow, both as a review and for those who haven't heard it to hear it for the first time. This is from Martin Heidegger on the Way to Language. It's a conversation between Martin Heidegger and a Japanese philosopher, one of whose professors had been trained by Heidegger. So the Japanese says, we Japanese do not think it strange if a dialogue leaves undefined what is really intended, or even restores it back to the keeping of the undefinable. Heidegger responds, that is part, I believe, of every dialogue that has turned out well between thinking beings. What Heidegger means by thinking is very much different than what anybody's self means by thinking. As if of its own accord, Heidegger says, it can take care that that undefinable something not only does not slip away, but displays its gathering force ever more luminously in the course of the dialogue. That's the methodology of the seminar. That's the methodology of transformation. Not a definition, not a description, not a narrative, not a story, not an understanding, not information. But whatever it is, displays its gathering force of the dialogue. And he doesn't mean display like something to look at, but rather something to be. Japanese response, our dialogues with our teacher probably failed to turn out so well. We younger men challenged him much too directly to satisfy our thirst for handy information. We are a culture that listens for handy information. Something's useless if you can't use it, isn't it? You see, maybe what empowers people cannot be used by them. Maybe we need a kind of listening that can be present for what is powerful and not useful. Heidegger responds, thirst for knowledge and greed for explanations never lead to a thinking inquiry, transformational inquiry. Curiosity is always the concealed arrogance of a self-consciousness that banks on a self-invented rationality. What does he mean by that? He means that you think that you were born in such a way that anything which is valid, you are going to understand. Therefore, anything you don't understand must be invalid. That's what he means. The will to know does not will to abide before what is worthy of thought. He's saying there exactly what I just said a moment ago, that this will for information, this will for tips, this will for prescriptions, this will for how am I going to use it? How does this apply? How am I going to fix it? How is this going to help me to fix it? Is no will to be with what is worthy of being with. It's different to be with than the will for knowledge or information or usefulness.
In the next section, Werner goes on to speak about what actually makes a difference in terms of effective action and leadership.
you know, in the normal course of events, what one is left with after doing work on something is a kind of menu of decisions that one has made. One has decided that, well, from now on, I'm going to stop doing this, and I am going to do that. I call those something like New Year's resolutions. And I think that they're just about as effective as most New Year's resolutions. That is to say that they have little or no effect at all. So I'm saying a kind of very strange thing. I'm almost saying that what we learn doesn't make much difference. And that's a kind of strange way of looking at things, because we live in a culture which says that the way you get confident about something, the way you get able about something, the way you get skillful about something is that you learn. And maybe in another sense of the word learn, I might accept that. But in the ordinary sense of the word learn, like gathering information, seeing what you did wrong, seeing what you might do right now, all of that kind of analysis, all of that stuff that leads up to understanding, in this case, what leadership is, like a set of characteristics or a set of properties, which either you don't have and ought to get, or which you do have and therefore ought to feel confident about. For me, there's no power in that. There's no power in learning about leadership. And it makes it difficult. The fact that there's no power in learning about leadership makes the whole issue difficult. And why it makes it difficult is because essentially the listening that we are, the commitment that we are, is the learning about. We're already well organized to learn about something, like get the information and get the data. And I'm suggesting to you that that doesn't make any difference. So the question is, what does make a difference? If that doesn't make any difference, what does make a difference? What is it that allows what we would call skill or ability or being a leader, so to speak, to actually be present in our lives, in our everyday concerns, and in our everyday being in the world? And I'm suggesting to you that you try out the possibility that being engaged in an inquiry about something, being engaged in an inquiry in a certain way, a certain kind of inquiring about something, allows not for a gathering of information or making a series of decisions or understanding what it is that you're dealing with, but that being engaged in an inquiry with regard to a certain issue, if the inquiry is engaged in a particular way, actually lets what it is that you might find out about in another situation actually be present in your life. And that's really all that interests me, is being a leader, not understanding leadership or having information about leadership. So we've created a set of distinctions as a tool for an inquiry. Not that these distinctions are the distinctions, and not that they're not, but we've created a set of distinctions as a tool for an inquiry. And the set of distinctions that we've created is leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account, and leadership in the domain of presence. And one of the things that I'd like you to come out of this seminar with is some mastery of the kind of inquiry, the conducting of which leaves you with a greater opening for being that into which you're inquiring. Could you follow that sentence? So I'm going to start hammering at this issue about leadership as a presence. because it's very much not like what we think it is. But while you're listening to the conversation of hammering out leadership as a presence, I'd like you also to be listening to an inquiry conducted with a set of distinctions called the domain of an observer giving an account in the domain of presence. What I mean by presence defies definition. Well, what do I mean like a presence? Give me a definition of presence. What do you mean by presence? You mean something that's physically there, something I can observe with my eyes and my ears and my nose and my sense of touch and my sense of smell? What do you mean as a presence? So the answer is that I don't have a definition, because what I mean by a presence is simply something like an opening that's distinct from the opening called the domain of an observer giving an account. Now, this is a very difficult part of the work, because we always want to get these tools shaped up very clearly. We want to know what is presence. And the answer to that is that there's no answer to that that makes any difference. It's the question, what is presence, that makes a difference. And this starts to get pretty difficult now. You see, you're engaged in an inquiry about the nature of leadership using a tool which you own, namely the tool of what is leadership like a presence, which tool you own like an inquiry. Pretty strange stuff. You're inquiring with an inquiry. Makes it difficult. This is not easy. This is not ordinary. And so it's going to require a kind of extraordinary listening on our part and really some training on our part. This is kind of like Aikido. And it's not something you learn in one session. It's something you have to be with until you are the possibility which it is. Yeah, you do all the exercises and you go through all the training, but nobody teaches you Aikido. You're in the presence of being coached in Aikido until you show up as Aikido. And this is very much like that. This is not something you learn to do like a series of steps you take, but something for which you are present with the intention that you show up as what this is. Essentially, what I'd like to do is to hear from you about what you discovered in this kind of inquiry into the distinction between leadership as a kind of how it looks in the stands, leadership as an account, and leadership as a practice. And
for as long as I can remember, I watched to see what are leaders, what do they look like, what do they do? And I remembered in looking after the last seminar, like at 5th grade or something, and I had to be the captain of the service squad girls. I mean, then I'd be a leader. And then all my life has been about looking to see what it is that a leader is, and then doing that.
Okay, now hold on, because Anne's saying something a lot more profound than we may be listening to. She's not just describing Anne. She's describing the culture of being which we are. See, it's not like Anne went through this process saying, what is a leader? It's not like Anne had these thoughts or this conversation with herself, what is a leader? But rather something like the culture of being in which you and I showed up as human beings is a clearing for leadership as an is, like a body or a bag of properties or characteristics. This is not, Anne's not giving you an insight into herself merely. She's giving you an insight into what it is to be human vis-a-vis the issue or the phenomenon of leadership. And she's saying something very powerful, that you and I are an opening for leadership like a set of properties, like something which is. It's as if what a leader is, like doing, is a list of prescriptions for action. And that if you were going to, now remember, you see, you and I have the notion that there's something over there called leadership. And that our job is to get it right in here, like represent it right over here, so that we can match what's over there. That's the underlying thing that none of us is saying. That's so taken for granted that we never even notice that about ourselves. The structure of interpretation which we are is that there's leadership over there. Our job is to get it right in here, like a description, like a representation of what's over there, so that we can act and be like what's over there. Remember that that's only a structure of interpretation. Everything I just said is not necessarily the way it is, but rather is the way we have it. That's just the way we have it. It's not necessarily like that. It's not necessarily true that there's something over there. It's not necessarily true if there is there that it can be represented over here. It's not necessarily true that if we represent it over here, we could duplicate what is over there as a representation here. All of that's up for grabs. All of that's questionable. All of that needs to be inquired into. In the moments of greatest power, you're never following a prescription. You're never acting out of a strategy. You're really kind of in a dance with the world. And somehow the world with which you are dancing is an opportunity or an opening or a clearing. That's very different than following a prescription, following a strategy. It's very different than being the victim of the circumstances out there. To be in a dance with life as an opening, as an opportunity, as a clearing, is very different than figuring your way through the circumstances. Okay, I want to stop what we're doing and shift ourselves to the question, what is leadership as a presence? What's on the court when you're on the court, rather than what's on the court when you're up in the stands? What's actually there like a presence? Peter?
Watching somebody else.
Okay, very good. So up in the stand, so if we stand back from the whole thing,
Okay.
there was you up in the stands watching somebody else. Now you noticed something down with the people you were watching, which is the comment of an observer giving an account. When you were giving that account, what was the guy and the gal down on the court, what was present? Now let me give you a little clue about how to do this. So one of the things that I imagine was present was somebody. Is that true?
Right.
There was actually somebody there. It was not an empty court. So one of the things that Peter is saying to us in this inquiry is maybe one of the things that's present in leadership down on the court is somebody that has a presence. Leadership, at least a part of what's there, is somebody.
Yeah. Somebody's doing something.
You don't get leadership on an empty court. A battlefield with no personnel has no possibility for the presence of leadership. Yes?
Right.
A family, a house with no people in it, has no possibility for leadership. So this is kind of obvious, but at least it's a place to start. That leadership as a presence is people. Okay, so what else is there? Like a presence, people, we got that much. What else? Like a presence is present.
There's action. There's
Okay, but what action? Okay, let's just stay with that. There's action. So leadership as a presence presences itself as action. People in action. See, what is hard about this is that you've got all conversation as descriptive, representational. I want you to open up the possibility of a conversation for presence, not a conversation for a description of what was present. So people in action. And we're not meaning to represent what's there, we're meaning to say what's there. People in action, what else? So leadership, there's no such thing as leadership. Peter's saying there's no such thing as leadership. If you're standing up in the stands, you can have a conversation about leadership, but the guys down on the court, there's no leadership down there. What's down there is people in action.
so all I have is a description of it, an observation.
Good. Now I want you to get down on the court and tell me what's there. So far, what you've got down there is people in action.
So there's a commitment.
No, can't see commitment. Not a presence. I don't mean you can't see it, therefore it's not a presence, but I'm trying to kind of engage you in how do you inquire into presence. See, is commitment ever present? No, that's always a conversation, an assessment about what's going on there. But the commitment itself is never present. What is present when up in the stands we say commitment? What prompts us to say commitment? What's actually present there?
I don't know.
Try this. Something about unrestrained action. Maybe something like unrestrained action, maybe something like consistent action, maybe something like a repetitive action, maybe something like action powerful enough to meet a resistance. I don't know. See, I don't know. And I don't care about the answer. What I care about is establishing ourselves in the domain of leadership as a presence. That's what this is all about. It's a trick. This is not really to get the answer. This is not, we're not going to give you a test to see if you got the answers right afterwards. You get as much out of this with the wrong answer. The point is to be here, creating yourself as a clearing for leadership as a presence, and you do that by engaging in the dialogue which the conversation is.
Is it action without concern?
Okay, good. Now, what does concern mean? See, no matter what he says, I'm going to have a question, aren't I? Why? Because I don't care about the answer. And besides which, if he gives us an answer that blows something open, nobody will not know that. That would be obvious. Yeah, so okay, something like an action without a concern, but you can't see an absence of concern down on the court, can you? What's there on the court when you and I, Peter, are saying that's commitment? What we mean by that is that's action without concern.
Anything I can think of is a description.
Yeah, it's okay. That's right. And every time you say it, I'm going to say that's a description of what's underneath that. Because, I'm going to say this 1,000 times a day. I can feel it coming. Because it's the inquiry where the power is, not the information you derive from the inquiry. Look, we've invented a new technology. We've invented a technology called ontological inquiry. Really, that's wrong. We've invented a technology called ontological design. The way you do ontological design is like Peter and I are doing it. Maybe it's this. But how could it be that? What's underneath that? Well, underneath that is this. Okay, but how could it be that? What's underneath that? And somehow, if Peter and I are doing this correctly, when we're all done, neither one of us will know anything we didn't know before, but there will be, life will now be an opening for that into which we've inquired. So Peter and I will find ourselves not remembering what to do to be leaders, or not remembering what property we need to have to be leaders, but rather we will find ourselves being leaders, if this works. That's strange. Nobody's ever worked in that before. And it doesn't satisfy the ordinary listening which we are for information. What was our last maybe?
Action without concern.
Yeah. So what? It can't be not. Not concerned isn't present. Okay. Now look down there on the court. Can I stop speaking up here in the stands and speak in the court? Now maybe I'd want to say that what's present that I'm calling action without concern is a kind of dancing with the world. That when I'm up in the stand saying, oh, a leader is one who acts without concern, what is actually present on the court is a dancing with the world. A kind of, because that's what, that kind of fits a little bit, doesn't it? What we would say up in the stands is, look at that guy move. No concern. But really what's going on down there on the court is, on the court, what's happening is a dancing with the world. That looks up in the stands like an action without concern, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Even though present on the court may be a deep concern. What dancing with the world would look like in the stands is action without concern. Even if there was a dancing with the world on the court that included lots of concerns, even self-doubt. See, what self-doubt and dancing with the world looks like up in the stands is action without concern. So now if you go around trying to act without concern, you get to be a nitwit, not a leader. If in fact what leadership is like a presence is a dancing with the world in the presence of one's concerns.
Oof.
But I don't know that any of that's accurate. And I don't much care. I care about a rigorous inquiry. Because I say that a well-designed, rigorous inquiry, while not leading to answers, while not leading to information, while not leading necessarily to understanding, leads to an opening, like a possibility, like a clearing for that into which I'm inquiring, in this case, leadership. Are we together?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay. Now I want to switch back. Now I want to know not what is leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account. So I don't want examples, except if you give examples to get to what I do want, which is I want to know what is the nature of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account. What is the nature of leadership there? Like, I mean something, when I say nature, I mean something closer to what are the principles? Or what are the design elements? I don't want to know, I don't want examples of the design. I want the design elements. That's the question. Robert?
One of the design elements seems to be consistently produces results, can be counted upon to produce results, a lot of results, even extraordinary results, consistently. And what I find fascinating when these people are interviewed with or when you read their conversations is it's whether they've scored 100 touchdowns, won 5 Academy Awards, it's grist for the mill for them.
Right.
It has a kind of ordinary everydayness to them, and it's a distinction that we make up here in the stands.
Yeah, very good. Okay, I want to get into that more, so let's mark that because I want to look at that from both sides. Very good. Okay, I'm going to give you some answers. I'm going to give them to you as maybes. Maybe leadership, maybe one of the design elements of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account is the element called properties. In other words, the conversation in the stands lives in a structure of interpretation that says that leadership is a matter of properties. And if you read the books on leadership, what you discover is that they're often about the properties of leaders. So somebody say out loud one of the properties of a leader. Assertiveness. Okay. Confidence. Yeah. Courage. Vision. What? Flexibility. What was that? Grace under pressure. All right, look. So, yeah, all right, look, hold on for a second. Because we could come up with an endless list. And some of them would actually be mutually exclusive. You have to be both left and right. All I want you to see is that in the domain of an observer giving an account, leadership is always going to show up as a body of properties lying inside the leader. A body of properties located in the leader. So what I need us to begin to see is that who we are is that leadership is a function of properties inside of us. Now, what I want us to begin to question here is whether that could ever be a way of being with leadership that was going to make any difference. How do you get properties inside yourself? Where do you get this courage stuff? And how do you get it inside? Can you begin to see that there's a certain weakness in that interpretation? That there's a certain weakness in this interpretation that leaders have properties inside themselves. The first off, the notion of inside themselves is kind of silly on its face. And then the idea that there are such properties, I don't know, where are they, free floating, or they grow on trees, or where the hell are these properties which wound up in them, and how did they get them in there? I mean, each of the questions brings you face to face with the absurdity of the interpretation. So now I've given you an example of a design characteristic of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account, that it has to do with properties inside the person who's the leader. What are some of the other design elements? And it's more important that you're asking the question than that you got an answer. What are some of the other design elements of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account? Let me give another suggestion. Another suggestion would be the division of the world into leaders and followers. People who lead and people who follow. Now that can get very complex and very subtle, where there's a kind of relationship between the leaders and followers aren't really followers, but people who are leading and all that noise. But nevertheless, it's inherent in the domain of the observer given an account leadership that there's this kind of separation, division between a leader and a follower. Now, sometimes the followers are leaders, and sometimes the leaders are followers, and I hate that cuteness about leaders standing behind the people they're following. I know all of the nice things to say about being a leader, all of the denials, and I have respect for none of them, because somewhere, somehow, down in the guts of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account is this structure of interpretation which divides the leader from the followers. Okay, the next aspect that I'd like to get into is the role of vision in leadership and the nature of vision and what that all has to do with. One of the things that I want to get clear about is that vision doesn't have much to do with leadership as a presence, I think. I just can't kind of, when I do these thought experiments, see any vision down there on the playing floor. And yet I somehow am not able to rule out the power that vision has in the phenomenon of leadership. So what that suggests to me is the need to invent another domain of distinction for leadership to live in. And where that takes, can I read this to you and get that out of the way so I can erase it? It's just a very, very, very useful quote from a Nobel laureate that says to undertake a project, as the word's derivation indicates, means to cast out an idea ahead of oneself so that it gains autonomy. That is to say, so that it's no longer dependent on the person who undertook the project in the first place, so that the project gains autonomy and is fulfilled not only by the efforts of its originator, but indeed independently of him as well. And another word which I think is very important is the word independently. What could that mean? A project, most projects worth doing are going to be realized not only by the efforts of its originator, but indeed independent of the originator. So I thought that was valuable, but who knows? At any rate, what I wanted to get to here was this issue about vision. And as I said, what we've got so far is really two domains. The domain of the observer giving an account. So the domain of the account, the domain in which leadership lives as something you represent, something you talk about, something with properties and characteristics, something you can describe, something you can define, like that. And leadership as a present, like what's actually there on the court. Now we've got this problem about vision. And if we take up the issue of vision and its role in leadership, and we're only armed with these two distinctions, my guess is that it's going to get us in trouble someplace down the pike, because it means either that the vision lives there as a presence, which at least in my present, when leadership is present, any of, I can't see the vision present there. And I know that the vision is present or often present in the domain of an observer giving an account, but I'm concerned less the kind of power that's available in the domain of an observer giving an account isn't a powerful enough domain of distinction for vision to live in. So that's why I left this kind of empty spot at the other end of the board where we may have to invent a domain for vision, which isn't a part of the tools that we've already got. But let's take a look at vision in the domain which we already do have, the one we inherit as human beings, this domain of the observer giving an account, and see what a vision might be like in that domain. So first off, I'm going to suggest that a vision in a domain of an observer giving an account is something like a dream about remote possibilities that you consider an ideal. And the operative word that I want to get in there is the word ideal. And I'd like to invite you to consider that what we think of as our vision is something very akin to an ideal, something